As the war continues in Ukraine, Congress has rushed to respond with legislation enacting sanctions against Russia. And there is a bipartisan support for this effort. However, some in Congress are trying to use this moment of bipartisan agreement to amend something called the Magnitsky Act in a way that could seriously threaten religious freedom. And here to explain what's happening is Arielle Del Turco, Assistant Director of the Center for Religious Liberty here at FRC. Arielle, welcome back to Washington Watch.
Good to be with you.
So I laid a little bit of the foundation there. Generally speaking, there's good legislation. Nobody wants to be sending more money to Russia than we need to be right now. This legislation would stop that from happening. But there are some games being played by some congressional Democrats who want to amend something called the Magnitsky Act. Can you tell us first, what is the Magnitsky Act?
Yeah, so the Global Magnitsky Act was passed in 2016, and its intention was to enable the U.S. government to target foreign individuals responsible of human rights violations for targeted financial sanctions. So it's a way of promoting human rights while not punishing maybe an entire government or an entire country. So it's a very powerful tool. But now what we're seeing with this new amendment is that they're trying to change the definition of the types of human rights violations that the U.S. can sanction an individual for, from gross violations of internationally recognized human rights to just serious human rights abuse. Now, the first term, the gross violations of international human rights, it has a legal definition in U.S. law. So we know what that means. It's a very high standard. But for serious human rights abuse, that has no legal definition. So essentially, that gives the federal government a lot of power and a lot of discretion to basically read anything they might consider a human rights violation to be a human rights violation and to be sanctionable, even if that's not been what we've generally understood to be human rights violations. So we're seeing a lot of ways and a lot of concerns of how this could be abused.
Now, within the law, the devil is always in the details. And when you start to change the definitions and change the standards of when something can be used, it's important to understand, why are we trying to change that definition? Have those who are sponsoring these amendments, proposing these amendments, explained why they want to lower the standard that would qualify someone for sanctions by the federal government?
Well, what they're saying is that an expansion in the definition will allow the U.S. to go after more human rights violators who deserve to be gone after. But really, when we read into the detail of the law, we see that the law does allow for serious human rights violators to be sufficiently sanctioned. And this expansion and this giving all this power to the federal government is really unnecessary. So specifically, some concerns that we have are that the president will get this power and then use it to sanction foreign individuals for, or even threaten to sanction foreign individuals for maybe having socially conservative policies. If we're hearing that abortion is the supposed right to abortion is now a human right, that opens the doorway for the U.S. government to promote a radical agenda abroad in a way that's really damaging to our foreign policy and our relations with other countries, and that's damaging for just the world.
And let's talk about how this might apply, because again, the current standard is a gross violation of internationally recognized human rights. And so taking the Russia example right now, there is an unprovoked attack, missiles being launched into neighborhoods, into children's hospitals. We know of warlords who have committed what is effectively genocide. And in some cases, we talked about earlier this week in Burma, it is an actual genocide. So we would all agree that if there are people committing genocide in a part of the world doing those things, that it would be great if the United States can use whatever influence it has to sanction those people, to punish them for those violations. But the concern is, if we lower the standard, given how the left thinks about violence, about human rights violations more recently, that something as benign as saying something that they find offensive, they could find to be a serious human right violation under the current standard. And a specific example of this, a Finnish parliament member, I think I'm going to pronounce this, I'm actually probably going to mispronounce this, Päivi Räsänen, who is currently in trial in Finland for tweeting a Bible verse about homosexuality that, of course, is politically incorrect. They found it to be hate speech. Is that the kind of behavior or activity that potentially the federal government could use this new definition to punish people for?
Well, in a worst case scenario, that's exactly what we're afraid of. So Päivi is someone, she's a longtime member of the Finnish parliament, a well-known Christian, but she's not a rebel rouser, she's not a firebrand. She is a former medical doctor and a grandmother. All she did was post a tweet questioning whether her own denomination should be supporting the Helsinki Pride Parade. And along with it, there was a photo of scripture from Romans, and that instigated a police investigation, and they went through 20 years worth of her public statements and found 3 statements that questioned homosexual conduct from a biblical worldview, and now she's being charged for a hate speech violation. And the maximum time that she could get is 2 years in jail for this. Now the prosecution is now just asking for a fine, but still, that's very serious. So when we're looking at cases around the world like this, the United States government has to make a choice. We've promoted religious freedom abroad for decades, but now are we going to promote religious freedom, or are we going to promote abusive and radical social agendas? And I think that the Global Magnitsky Act, it's a great human rights tool. I work on international religious freedom every day. I find this to be very valuable to punish severe human rights violators, but we need to keep this on the straight and narrow path and make sure that the integrity of the State Department's human rights advocacy is upheld.
Arielle, that's a great point. We've got about 30 seconds left. What's the status of this? What can people do if they want to make sure that this definition in the Magnitsky Act is not changed so that it could be abused by the federal government?
Well, people can let their representatives know that we like the Global Magnitsky Act, but we want to keep its integrity and we don't want to be changing definitions needlessly.
We agree with that, and we encourage people to do so. Arielle Del Turco, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.